additional spending for the war with Iraq and Homeland Security. The Senate Appropriations Committee met yesterday to discuss the request. In this 90-minute portion, members hear from Defense Secretary Rumsfeld.
The Secretary is the guy to who he wants at the table. Mr. Secretary, we've waived opening statements. We'd like to have your statement as short as possible. I know you're under some time restraints, and after you finish, we will go on to your secretaries, Secretary Wolfowitz and Secretary Zakheim, to answer the respondents to the question. General Myers, I know we all know you're under tremendous pressure, so we'd accept your time, what time you have available for us, sir. Secretary Rumsfeld.
Would you prefer that I not make a statement, or should I
We prefer you make your statement. We'll put the whole thing in the record. I've already seen it. And members have it in front of them. But whatever statement you wish to make, Mr. Secretary.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Chairman. We're now less than a week, about a week, into the Operation Iraqi Freedom. The major ground attack began on 10 o'clock last Thursday, and the air war began on Friday, the following day at 1 p.m., so it'll be a week tomorrow. While the conflict is well begun, it has really only begun, and we're still closer to the beginning than to the end. The coalition air crews have flown thousands of sorties, striking at leadership and Republican Guard targets day and night, except for the periods of very bad weather. They've raced across on the ground some 200 miles of Iraqi territory to reach a point about 50 kilometers south of Baghdad in less than a week. It's an impressive rate of advance. They have secured the Iraqi southern oil fields. There were 10, I believe, plus or minus 10 oil wells that were either aflame or had been ruptured, and crews are working on them to put out the fires at the present time. In the north, the coalition has launched attacks on terrorist targets and is having success in disrupting terrorist operations and prevented an Iraqi advance against the Kurds, at least thus far. And in the west, the forces have had good success in securing the region and dealing with the regime's capability to threaten neighboring countries from the scud baskets in that part of Iraq. The campaign could well grow more dangerous in the coming days and weeks as the forces close in on Baghdad and begin to have to deal with the Republican Guard forces north of Tikrit, south of Baghdad. But the outcome is assured. The regime of Saddam Hussein will be removed, and the only thing that remains unclear is precisely how long it will take. We do know that these efforts cost money. The costs of military operations in Iraq and the other missions currently underway in the global war on terror can obviously not be absorbed without an emergency supplemental appropriation that the President's requested. Since the new fiscal year began, every month since October of 2002, that's October, November, December, January, February, March, we have had to borrow from other programs because the war on terrorism was not funded. We have to recognize that that pattern cannot really continue much longer. The services have already gone through all of their discretionary spending for the first, second, and third quarters of 2003, and we'll soon have exhausted the fourth quarter discretionary funding. If this continues, we'll run out of discretionary funds by late spring or early summer, depending on what the costs are, which are not knowable at the present time, and that could force a curtailment of training, maintenance, and other critical activities. The President's supplemental request is for $74.7 billion. That includes some $62.6 for the Department of Defense to support military operations in Iraq and throughout the global war on terror. The request includes, among other things, $7.1 billion for the round-trip costs of transporting the forces and equipping to and from the theater of operations. some $13.1 billion to provide warfighters in theater with fuel, supplies, repair parts, maintenance, and other operational support that they need. About $15.6 billion for incremental personnel costs, such as for special pay and compensation for the mobilized reserves. $7.2 billion to start the process of reconstituting our forces by replacing the cruise missiles, the smart bombs, and other key munitions that are being expended in the course of the conflict. $12 billion for stability operations, military operations to root out terrorist networks and deal with any remaining pockets of resistance, humanitarian assistance, and operations to search for and destroy Iraqi weapons of mass destruction. $1.5 billion for coalition support for the global war on terror, including $1.3 billion for reimbursement to Pakistan and other key cooperating nations assisting in the effort in Afghanistan, and $165 million for the training of the Afghan National Army, and $6.1 billion for other requirements outlined in the request to support military operations in Iraq and globally. Of the $62.6 billion the President requested in this supplemental for DoD, some $30.6 billion are funds that have either already been spent or have been committed, including the costs of flowing forces into the region to support the diplomatic efforts before Operation Iraqi Freedom began. If the regime had agreed voluntarily to disarm and prevent a war, the cost of sustaining that military pressure through the rest of the fiscal year would have been in excess of $40 billion. So even without a war, the cost of disarming Iraq would have been significant. The President has also requested funds in the supplemental for both an Iraqi Relief and Reconstitution Fund and a Natural Resources Risk Remediation Fund to help with emergency firefighting and repair of damage to oil facilities. But let me be clear, when it comes to reconstruction, before we turn to the American taxpayer, we will turn first to the resources of the Iraqi government and the international community. That's why the President last week seized frozen Iraqi assets in the United States so that they can be put to use to help rebuild the country. Once Saddam Hussein is gone, the U.S. will work with the Iraqi Interim Authority that will be established to tap Iraq's oil revenues, the funds Iraq is owed in the United Nations Oil for Food Program, and other Iraqi resources to fund that effort. Reconstruction will require a significant international effort. And the threat posed by Saddam Hussein's regime is a global threat, which is why some 49 nations have now publicly associated themselves in the coalition against Iraq. And many more nations are helping privately, some 10 or 11. I believe the total number of countries cooperating in one way or another now is approaching in the mid-60s. Already a number of countries have indicated that they want to help with reconstruction and stability in a post-Saddam Iraq. In addition to needing the supplemental, Mr. Chairman and members of the committee, we also need greater flexibility as to how that money is spent so we can adjust to the changing circumstances. It's our hope that the period of intense combat in Iraq will be as short as possible, but it's not knowable, and that the coalition operations can shift fairly quickly from combat to restoring stability and civil order, supplying humanitarian assistance, and helping Iraq's people rebuild and assume functional and political authority from the coalition. That's the hope. But when it will happen is not knowable. We do not know when the period of intense combat will end. We do not yet know how much damage there will be to the Iraqi infrastructure, though the coalition forces are making efforts to keep that damage minimal while inflicting maximum damage to regime targets. We do not know how the international effort will unfold and the specifics of what each country may be willing to offer. We cannot know the extent to which the UN will be permitted to help the Iraqi people, what access the coalition will have to the UN Oil for Food Program, what economic sanctions might be lifted, and the answers to many other questions. The point is that with so many unknowns, the administration clearly needs some flexibility. Just as the military plan that General Franks has developed has flexibility built into it so that our forces can deal with unexpected events in the battlefield, our budget plan must also have flexibility to deal with the changing circumstances on the ground. That's why we believe it's important that the funding request for the Defense Emergency Response Fund be appropriated in that fund with its own transfer authority, so we will have the flexibility to respond to the changes on the ground. It's also important that Congress approve the general provisions the President has requested in the supplemental, especially the request for increased general transfer authority. The President's requested a transfer authority ceiling of 2.5% of the fiscal year 2003 defense budget. We believe that figure is reasonable and that the increased flexibility is needed. We can't know how long the effort in Iraq is going to last, and we certainly can't tell what it's going to cost. What I do know is that whatever it ends up costing, it will be small compared to the cost in lives and treasure of another attack like the one we experienced on September 11th, or a weapons of mass destruction attack that could be far worse. The Milken Institute estimated that metropolitan areas throughout the U.S. sustained losses of about $191 billion as a result of 9/11, and some 1.6 million jobs were lost as a result of the attacks. That's not to mention the cost in lives and the pain and suffering of so many who lost husbands, wives, fathers, mothers, sons and daughters and sisters and brothers on that terrible day. Our mission in the global war on terror is to do everything in our power to prevent a chemical, biological, or nuclear attack that would make 9/11 seem modest by comparison. An attack where we could lose not just 3,000, but 30,000 or 300,000 or more. There's no question but that $74.7 billion is a great deal of money. But the cost of not investing that $74 billion would be far greater. We need the funds, we need the flexibility as to how they're spent, so we can adapt to the unknowable circumstances that are unfolding in the weeks and months ahead. We will continue to brief the Congress regularly as events unfold on the ground and as these unknowns come into better focus. We appreciate the strong support that Congress has shown for the men and women in uniform. They are doing a truly remarkable job, and I know that they will succeed in their mission. General Myers?
General Myers?
Mr. Chairman, I have a short statement. Good morning, Mr. Chairman and members of the committee. It's a pleasure to be here with you. I won't repeat the Secretary, but I'd like to take this opportunity to point out the dramatic successes that our servicemen and women have achieved this week in Iraq. They've executed our plan superbly and have exploited the flexibility inherent in that plan. Their performance is marvelous, and I think we are all very proud of them. The environment is demanding, and our men and women are offering exceptional examples of the dedication, bravery, and professionalism of our joint force. In the first 100 hours of the ground phase of Desert Storm back in 1991, we moved a bit over 100 miles into Iraq. Yet, as Secretary Rumsfeld mentioned, coalition troops moved over 200 miles into Iraq during Operation Iraqi Freedom in the first 36 hours. That is about twice as far in less than half the time. I must also point out that our special operation teams throughout the country, in cooperation with other U.S. government agency assets, have done an incredible job and a largely unrecognized job so far, for good reason. We are additionally engaged in the global war on terror in the Philippines and in Georgia, and we're still fighting the Al-Qaeda, remnants of Al-Qaeda and Taliban in Afghanistan. The global war on terror is, in fact, global in scope and in nature. All of our nation's soldiers, sailors, airmen, Marines, and Coast Guardsmen, as well as our Department of Defense civilians and coalition partners, have performed exceptionally well. But this effort of protecting America in our new and challenging strategic environment has generated significant cost. The American and British people have borne the dramatic and tragic price of casualties in battle here recently, and we grieve with the families of these heroes. We will not forget their sacrifice. They are a reminder of the best our country and Britain has to offer. There is no doubt that we will succeed in disarming Iraq. We will remove their weapons of mass destruction. We will remove their thuggish leader. And we will lift the people of Iraq from under the boot of their oppressor. But we must recognize, though it pales in personal importance, that we have borne steep monetary expenditures fighting the war on terror and prosecuting the campaign in Iraq. As we meet here today, our nation's military forces are in need of prompt and full passage of the President's supplemental request. The Department cannot absorb the more than $62 billion in incremental costs the war on terror has demanded. In fact, as the Secretary has said, the 4 military services will soon exhaust borrowing from their fourth quarter operations and maintenance accounts. Without prompt passage of supplemental appropriations, most of the services' operational and maintenance and military personnel accounts will run out of funding. Prompt funding is needed to sustain our troops in the field as well, and it's important to ensure that those in training at home have the best possible support to accomplish their vital task of providing for the common defense for today and for tomorrow. And if a full request is not appropriated, shortfalls would cause a severe curtailment of training, maintenance, and other funding from later in the fiscal year. This would undoubtedly reduce the readiness and the morale of our hardworking and hard-fighting men and women, and it would reduce Defense Department efforts to fight the global war on terrorism. Indeed, prompt funding will further demonstrate to our men and women that they have the full and unwavering support of the people of the United States. While we have troops in combat, the importance of support from home cannot be overstated, and it's up to all of us to show them that our words are reflected in our actions. Furthermore, given the challenging dynamics in the war on terror, at this time, flexibility of execution is just as important as flexibility on the battlefield, as the Secretary said. And this flexibility in execution will enable the Department to rapidly meet unknowable, unforeseen requirements to achieve the greatest payoff. Members of the committee, Secretary Rumsfeld has outlined our expenses by operational phases and other funds and provisions. These are our best projections of our expenses in defeating the Iraqi regime and winning the war on terror. We appreciate your support, and it's essential to our success in protecting America and winning the war on terror that we pass this supplemental. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Let me thank you for three things. First, for your tremendous leadership. Second, for the briefings that you've given to us now every day since this war has commenced. This is not a classified hearing here, so we don't expect to go into some of the things you've told us in those sessions. But third, I want to thank you for the embedded journalism that you've developed. It has given the world an experience in terms of knowing war and knowing the trials and tribulations of those who must fight a war. And clearly, it was a risky decision, but the right one to make. So I personally thank you for that. I have but one question, and that is, I might have some that we'll submit in writing to the staff, Mr. Secretary, but your supplemental request outlines 4 broad phases of the war that we're conducting. Can you outline here for us now what are those phases and where are we today in regard to those phases?
Do that?
Yes, sir. We're currently in phase 3, which is combat operations. The first 2 phases, we're getting ready for that. The second phase was building up the forces and being prepared. Then the fourth phase is at the end of the conflict is the reconstruction of Iraq. It's and it has many different parts to it, but the principal parts would be ensuring the territorial integrity of Iraq, to ensure that the factions are not fighting among themselves in the various ethnic groups, to ensure that we can locate, secure, and take appropriate action with weapons of mass destruction sites, and that we bring on, along at the same time, that we bring on an Iraqi interim administration that can stand up and hopefully fairly expeditiously start running their country. And that's the phase 4. That follows the phase that we're in right now, which is phase 3.
One way to think about it is, if you think of Afghanistan, the entire country does not necessarily move from one phase to another. In Afghanistan, for example, we're in phase 3 in some places where there are still kinetics. In other places, we're in phase 4, which is in the post-conflict stabilization period. And I suspect that will be happening in Iraq as well, that there will be, it will roll across the country. And we'll be beginning the phase 4 probably in portions of the country before the rest of the country is stabilized.
That raises another question. You've got a request for $62.6 billion, and the statement is that $30.3 billion have already been spent or committed. So the flexibility you seek is on the funds that are left to be spent or committed, right?
The flexibility is each statement. The first statement is correct. We believe that of the total request of $60+ billion, some $30+ billion has either been spent or committed. That is to say, it is what the global war on terror is costing. It's what it costs to flow forces over. It's an estimate on things that have been already expended, munitions. The request, however, is for the flexibility for the entire amount. And I think it's correct to say, Dov, go ahead and clarify it.
Sure. The $30.3 billion, Senator, you're absolutely right. We have a pretty good sense of the accounts and where the money will go, but it's still an estimate. And we still may have overages and underages in those accounts. So we still need the flexibility throughout. What we tried to do was give the committee a better sense of where the money was going when we knew it, but it's still only a sense, sir. We do need the flexibility for the entire amount.
Thank you very much. Senator Byrd?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Mr. Secretary. Thank you, General. I'm sure that I speak for everyone here when I compliment the fighting men and women who are out there under very extreme and serious circumstances. Compliment them for their bravery and for doing their job so well. I'm very sorry that we don't have the time that we ought to have on this very, very important bill. Let me first, Mr. Secretary, say that in your prepared statement, I've noted the word flexibility at least a half dozen times, and I've heard that word kicked around here by others. I heard it down at the White House the other night. I expressed my suspicions concerning the word flexibility at that time. And as I see it here, I must ask you, I wish I could ask more questions, which we had the time, because this is to me, this is a very serious thing that we're being asked to do. The defense portion of the supplemental includes $1.4 billion for the support of coalition partners in the war on Iraq and the war against terrorism. You request the authority to exempt these funds from congressional notification procedures and from all laws that regulate how the United States may give and to its friends. Those laws are there for a reason. We should be careful about what kind of and we give to other countries. During the Iran-Iraq war, the United States sent anthrax, brucella, and botulinum to Iraq, which may have formed the basis of their biological weapons program. Can you explain, Secretary Rumsfeld, why the $1.4 billion in foreign aid should be exempt from any kind of oversight outside of the Department of Defense, Department of State, and the Office of Management and Budget? Why should Congress not have some say as to how the money is used so that we can ensure that the aid is consistent with the long-term national security interests of the United States?
Senator, there's no question but that Congress has a critically important role to play, and particularly with respect to the purse strings. I can give you possibly some examples of things that occurred very recently that we were not able to do for long, long periods of time.
Mr. Secretary, I hope you'll excuse me for interrupting you. My time is limited. Could you give me a more direct answer to the questions I asked? If we had more time, I'm sure that what you were about to say would be helpful. I think we can get to the questions and the answers more quickly, if we might.
Well, you indicated that there would not be notification to Congress. There would be. Congress would be fully aware of how the funds were spent. Any implication to the contrary, I think, would be inaccurate. The question is whether there should be prior notification to a number of committees and then a long period of months prior to the time that those funds can be expended. And I will give you two specific examples. The United States owed Pakistan, I don't know, several $100 million for months and months and months and months, and we were unable to pay them. And if we're asking countries to cooperate with us and assist us and provide fuel and provide apron space on an airfield, and we're not able to pay them for the funds that they're owed for that service, because for I think it was in this case 6 months. I could be wrong. It's more. He says it's more. We couldn't pay the Afghan National Army, for example, to help train them. We couldn't get that started in time. It took months. We had to finally go out and scrounge around and figure out a dozen different ways to do things. There are certainly things that come up that are not knowable in advance. It would be wonderful if everything were knowable a year and a half in advance, but they aren't.
Well, Mr. Secretary, this isn't the first war we've fought. And I'm sure the same thing could have been said in any of the wars that have preceded us: World War I, World War II, the Korean War, the Vietnam War, and other wars. And I can't see the necessity of having additional flexibilities given in this instance that we haven't had before. It would seem to me that Congress will certainly respond quickly to any needs that can be substantiated by the department in this period of time. Secretary Rumsfeld, the supplemental request includes $59.9 billion for the Defense Emergency Response Fund. Last year, the Defense Department requested a similar $10 billion reserve fund for operations in Afghanistan. Congress disagreed and worked with you to specify accounts for funding. Is there a specific reason why such an approach would not work today?
Senator, because the Congress did not provide the $10 billion that we requested, the Department of Defense had to borrow from other accounts all through October, all through November, all through December, all through January, until we finally got $6.1 billion, thanks to this committee and the Congress, to pay back money that had already been spent. It's just a terrible way to operate. To have to run to other accounts and pull money out and spend it for things you know you're going to have to spend it for is simply not, in my view, a good way to manage our affairs.
Mr. Secretary, I understand it may be a terrible way, but we're talking about the expenditure of the taxpayers' money, and the American people have a right to believe that their money is being spent most prudently. And Congress, I know it may be difficult to have the taxpayers' representatives in Congress to have to place limitations on the various departments, but this is something that has to be done. We're talking about the liberties of the American people, and it seems to me that we've done very well over the several decades in fighting the wars. There are limitations, there will be limitations, there ought to be limitations. And I regret that you have to live under these limitations, but it's not asking too much of the American people to have their representatives in Congress require the agency heads to answer questions and to place limitations on their spending. I cite Madison Federalist number 48. Power is of an over-encroaching nature. I'm sorry I don't have my glasses with me, but so it slows me down a little bit. Power is of an encroaching nature, and it ought to be effectually restrained from passing the limits assigned to it. Now, Mr. Secretary, I'm sorry you have to labor under these limits, but we've always had them, and we've had wars before, and it's not too much to ask of the department to live within these limitations. Edmund Burke said, the people never give up their liberties except under some delusion. So here we're being asked to give up the people's liberties in the interest of flexibility. Mr. Secretary, I'm against giving additional flexibility. I will give every dollar, I'll support every dollar I can to help the troops and provide for their safety and to help win the war. But to have us extend these limitations to the extent that there is being asked here, I think it's too much. The reason we have separation of powers is to protect the liberties of the people. And the checks and balances and the separation of powers have served the people well now for 215 years. And so count me out when you ask for these additional flexibilities. I think Congress will respond to the needs whenever the case is made. But we can't afford to give this administration or any other administration a blank check. We didn't give you a blank check when you were Secretary of Defense in the 1970s. And I don't expect to support giving the blank check to any administration. The people have a right to know how their monies are spent and to believe that they're being spent prudently. And I hope that the Congress will be very recreant when it comes to giving up these limitations, because after all, they protect the liberties of the American people. As long as we have a separation of powers and checks and balances that are written into this Constitution, which you have to live by, which I have to live by, then the liberties of the American people will be secure. I guess I've overrun my time. Thank you, Mr. Secretary.
Yes, sir. Senator, my recollection is there was a Defense Emergency Response Fund in the September '02 supplemental.
Yes, I remember that. If I had time, I'd go into that.
And Mr. Secretary, there will be one this time, too. Senator Cochran?
Mr. Chairman, thank you. General Myers, one question that I have that I think we'd all be interested in hearing a response to is the extent to which you have what you need to wage the war in Iraq so that we do have a successful conclusion. Are there any items of munitions or equipment or men and women who are necessary for the conduct of this war successfully that you foresee right now because of lack of funds or shortfalls in funding?
Senator Cochran, right now, I think our men and women have everything they need to prosecute our effort in Iraq and also prosecute the global war on terrorism, which Iraq is a part of course, to include our efforts in Afghanistan and other places around the world. As we indicated in both our opening statements, though, the way, and I don't think it's a question of equipment as much as it is of funding, personnel costs, and other operations and maintenance costs. The money that's been used to fund what we've been doing up to now has been taken from fourth quarter funds from the various services, now creating a need to replenish those funds, or we're going to find out here in May or June that the services are out of their personnel funding in their accounts, or they're out of their operations and maintenance accounts. So, but right now, we are fine, and if we get this supplemental in a timely manner, it will continue to be fine. I cannot think of anything at this point that we can put funding to that would have an impact on this battlefield today. Clearly, you'll see some things in the 04, and you already have in the 04 budget that shore up some of our systems in the future. But now we're in good shape.
Mr. Secretary, I assume that there may be an application of a phrase that I remember from law school: time is of the essence. If we act quickly, you can use the funds that we are appropriating more efficiently and more effectively to ensure that we win the war and that we win the war against terror as well.
Absolutely, Senator. There's no question. We've already gone through, as I say, some period of months without the supplemental funds that are needed, and we're anxious to have the appropriation so that we can proceed in an orderly and businesslike way.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Senator Noy?
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Secretary, since the bulk of the funds in the requests are not broken down by service, how can the services know what portion they will get so they can make appropriate plans to use such funds?
Of course, the war is not being fought by services. It's being, as you well know, is being fought in a combatant command by joint forces, and how the decision is made by the combatant commander to use one element of a service or another of a different service is something that evolves as the circumstance on the ground and in the air and at the sea take place. The allocation will end up being based on usage and consumption, and that's a judgment that evolves as the combatant commander makes decisions as to how he wants to use the various forces. And it ultimately then goes into the normal accounts of the services as a reimbursement for the expenditure of that usage or that consumption.
The chairman of this committee has indicated that he will do his best to finish this process by Easter. Can you assure this committee that the funds will be dispersed as expeditiously as this committee is doing? Because these are reimbursements, aren't they?
What we will have to do is to go back and immediately start using the funds that are appropriated by the Congress to replenish the accounts that have been drained during the already now for 3/4 worth of those accounts.
Senator Yield,
Yes.
why can't you give us those figures or put it in the law? Why do we have to wait?
Dove?
Well, again, Senator, as I mentioned earlier, what we know already or think we know, we've listed, and that was the $30.3 billion that we discussed earlier. And as the Secretary just said, as we consume and as we know what we've consumed, then, of course, we will allocate directly to the accounts and we'll keep the Congress fully informed. We don't know how the war exactly plays out in terms of specific consumption, and that's why we can't predict exactly what account money will go to.
For example, we know what it costs to flow forces over. General Franks very likely will make judgments as to which forces he wants to put in theater, which forces he doesn't want to put in theater, depending on how long the conflict goes, which forces he wants to use as replacement forces, so that forces that have been in the battle for a period can be flowed home. And that would vary from service to service. We can come up with gross numbers in terms of what it's likely to be, but in terms of being confident today that you would know precisely which service would need to be reimbursed in advance, it's simply not possible.
This supplemental request will reimburse for funds expended. Is that correct?
No, sir, it is the supplemental, that the DOD portion of the supplemental is not the cost of the war. It is not for all that's been expended. It is for what's been expended, what's been committed, but not expended. That is to say, once you take the forces over, you've got to be able to bring them back. So there's funds in here to bring them back, even though it's not expended. We think of it as committed, and for a reasonable anticipation of what will be required for the remainder of the fiscal year. It's really those three categories.
And this request will meet all the requirements of the services?
No, sir, I can't say that. How this conflict will play out is not, I can't know. I don't know anyone on the face of the earth who can know. And therefore, it's not possible to say that it will meet. It's conceivable that there will be needs that will not be met, and we would have to come back and discuss those kinds of things. But it's not, I'm not saying that's the case. I just can't promise you that they would all be met. Certainly, we would go back and meet the needs of the services in terms of the things they've expended already.
Thank you, sir. Thank you, Mr.
Thank you. Senator Bond?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman and Mr. Secretary in General. I hope you'll convey, as all my colleagues do, are the best wishes on behalf of the people that we serve, for the military men and women who are at risk, and know that our thanks and prayers are with them. Question about, I guess, to General Myers. We're reading about the Iraqi Fedayeen, Saddam, and the other paramilitary groups harassing the supply lines. Is this causing, is this just mere deadly harassment, or is this going to require more time and resources be spent on protecting the supply lines and the rear and delaying our advance to Baghdad?
This will not delay the execution of the plan as laid out by General Franks. It can be, I think, characterized more as harassment at this point, and it's being dealt with appropriately, I think. I won't get into the operational details, but General Franks has taken means to deal with this group. It's tough to characterize them because of the way they act. And if you're watching TV this morning, they had some soldiers from Landstuhl Hospital that happened to run across one of these groups that were dressed in traditional garb, took that garb off when they and pretended to surrender, took that garb off when they got closer and revealed that they indeed had uniforms underneath and weapons, and of course they were taken care of. But I think a better description is probably regime death squads, because that's what they're doing. They are putting guns on people's heads, the Iraqi citizens, to force them to continue to fight when they'd much rather give up. But there are enough of them where it's a bit of it's something that has to be dealt with, and so we're dealing with that as we speak.
And obviously, there is a hope, but not broadly realized, that there will be more major units defecting. At the same time, we hear reports that these death squads are threatening anybody who seeks to desert with death. They're using the paramilitary groups. How long do you think that can last, or at what point do you think we will have degraded their capabilities sufficiently that they will not be able to prevent major defections?
I don't know that that's knowable exactly. I think in the larger population centers are probably different from the less populated areas, certainly along the lines of communication on supply lines. Like I said, it's not having a major impact. In fact, it's not having any impact on the supplies reaching our troops, our forward troops, and we're just going to have to stay at it. There's a lot of other pieces, and it starts to get into operational matters, and I prefer not to talk about it here, but it's part of the overall campaign is to quickly diminish their capability. We're doing that. Hundreds of them have been engaged. Hundreds of them have been dealt with, and that will continue.
Mr. Secretary, you talked about Phase 4, and there's a request of some $2.4 billion for the new flexible account for humanitarian relief to the people of Afghanistan. In Phase 4, how long is the Defense Department going to be responsible for that reconstruction humanitarian aid? Is this going to be moved over to another account where we should be funding either the State Department, USAID, or others? How much? And a two-part question. And the second part is you've raised in your written statement the concern that France is threatening to veto the Food for Peace program. How much money do you see is available from international sources to provide the humanitarian relief and reconstruction that we hope and expect for Iraq?
These are issues that are currently being discussed and negotiated and considered. The sources of funds include the following, at least. One is frozen assets in our country and other countries. A second source is there's some number that's not quite clear, $10 or $12 billion in the UN oil for food accounts, some portion of which is committed to existing contracts, but the contracts were contracts entered into by Saddam Hussein's regime. And one would think that a serious review of those contracts would free up a lot of that money as well. So if it's 7 out of the $12 billion that are committed to contracts, I would anticipate that a careful scrub of those contracts would mean that there would be less than $7 billion committed and therefore more available. Third, there are potential oil revenues. It looks at the moment as though the bulk of the Iraqi oil wells are not damaged and not aflame, which is very fortunate. And of course, those are revenues that ought to be available for the Iraqi people and for the people of that country. And third, there are coalition contributions. Already countries are making contributions in the country. There's a World Food is providing assistance. The UK has a ship, the Sir Galahad, that's off the port south of Iraq, waiting to come in as soon as they're certain that the mines have been cleared. Neighboring countries have offered medical assistance and a whole host of things. So there undoubtedly will be an international donors conference to raise money. And there are a variety of places that funds can come for this.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Senator Hollings?
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Secretary, don't worry about the money. You know and I know that you're going to get the money. Otherwise, rather than a money supplemental, we ought to be thinking about a manpower supplemental. We just set aside Secretary Ridge, and you and Secretary Ridge are fighting over the same manpower. Last weekend with Orange Alert, all our Guard is committed. All our reserves are committed. So the poor governor, he had to put parole officers around the port of Charleston. And you can't have 12 peacekeeping commitments, a war in Afghanistan and a war in Iraq, and these long commitments, because what we're teaching them here after this engagement is they won't be able to afford to serve in the reserve. They won't be able to afford to serve in the Guard. But most particularly, Mr. Secretary, get this administration to ask not just for the money, but how to pay for it. The people of America are ready to sacrifice. They're ready to pay for this. I know Karl Rove thinks you need a tax cut in order to get reelected. But this is an embarrassment to this senator. I've been in government for 50 years, and what you've got me doing is telling that grunt, we want you to go into battle, and we hope you don't get killed. And the reason we hope you don't get killed is we want you to hurry back so I can give you the bill. This generation, this Congress, this administration ain't going to pay for it. We need a tax cut so I can go to Disney World. Now, that's just outrageous nonsense. And so just not ask for the money. Please hurry up and submit how you folks think we ought to raise the revenue and pay for the war. Now's the time for the sacrifice.
Senator, on the people piece of it, you're right. The Guard and Reserve folks do a wonderful job, and they're critically important to the total force concept. And there are times when the call-up occurs that some of the people in the call-up are people that do police work or they do fireman work and various things that the Homeland Security people would like to have. The two things we're trying to do in that connection. One is we're trying to get people in uniform out of jobs that are not military tasks. There are so many people, men and women in uniform, who are doing functions all across this town and around the world that are not truly military activities, and we can fix that. Second, we need authority, additional authority, so that we can, in fact, contract out to civilians to do certain functions. We have a terrible time, for example, trying to hire security people in the United States to protect various aspects of bases. We're required to some extent to use military people, or at least have been over a period of time. And to the extent we can get military people doing things that involve our core competence and not being required to do things that are not core competencies of the military, we'll be a lot better off.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Senator Gregg.
I thought we were recognizing on the basis of seniority, which would put Senator Shelby.
Go ahead.
I assumed you were senior, but you're not.
Go ahead.
Senator Shelby?
Thank you. Mr. Secretary, Secretary Wolfowitz, and General Myers, I'll be brief, but I want to commend you, all of you, for what you've done and what you're doing, your leadership. I don't believe you've asked for a blank check. You've been specific. You've asked for flexibility, and you've asked for resources. I think that we need to give you all the resources, Mr. Secretary, that you need to prosecute and win this war. We should not even blink. We should give you the flexibility that you need to
finance this, to conduct it. As you said, as you said clearly in your statement, there are a lot of unknowables here. You don't know everything. There's no way to know it. But the least I believe this committee can do is to expedite the supplemental as fast as we can to make sure you have the resources to do what you do best, and you're going to do it. That's all I want to say. I'm here to support you.
Thank you very much, Senator Shelby.
Senator Leahy.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Secretary, I don't think either you or anybody at the White House, and certainly wasn't the impression given at our meeting we had at the White House with the President, the Vice President, and others a couple days back. No one has any question, but you'll get the money for the troops in the field. We all know that. The question is how much, when, and why. We have Tom Ricks noted in today's Washington Post that the fighting's been a lot more ferocious than planned. It could take longer than expected, and I think General Myers and the others would be the first to say that there is no such thing as a military plan where you can anticipate every single contingency. It's impossible. We know we have the best trained, best equipped men and women in our Army, our Air Force, our Navy, our Marines are there, but there are unexpected things that happen. Whether it's a friendly fire incident, it's weather, or anything else. But you will get the money. What we want to know, this is going to go on a lot longer than may have been expected. Are you coming back in the weeks and months ahead for more FY03 money? Do you anticipate that you will?
Senator, the people who look at this, and they looked at the Department of State, the Department of Homeland Security, the Department of Defense, the intelligence community, and came forward with the best estimate they could. Is it going to prove out over the coming months? I don't know. Do we believe that it's the best possible estimate at the present time? Yes.
I was looking at some of the pictures, of U.S. aid arriving in southern Iraq yesterday. I know you are committed. I know, Senator, I know.
I couldn't understand you. I'm sorry.
I looked at some of the pictures of U.S. aid, food aid and whatnot, arriving in southern Iraq yesterday. I know you're committed. The President's committed. General Myers, everybody else is committed to getting aid there. Obviously, initially at this, it's rather haphazard. People were grabbing things off a truck and so on. The desperation is obvious. Who's in charge of the aid right now? Is it General Gardner or is it USAID? Who's in charge of that?
First, the aid is coming in a variety of different ways. It's coming in directly with military forces. Coalition forces, as they go into the country, are bringing food, they're bringing water that's available for people. There is not at the moment any evidence, any good intelligence that suggests there's a humanitarian crisis in that country. The people had been given extra rations over a period of months now, and the estimate has been that they have somewhere between 2, 4, or 6 weeks of food, many of the people in the country. Next, the food aid is then coming in through international organizations. World Food is bringing food in. The British have a ship standing off the port ready to bring in food. Something like 380 tons of food.
I don't question that, Mr. Secretary, but my question is this. There has to be a determination when it goes through. Some of the same people who are in the ship staying outside say, of course, they can't move until security is such. I mean, who determines that? There has to be somebody who's kind of ultimately
General
in charge.
General Franks. It's a war zone. And there's a unified command, and it goes right up to him.
And once he determines there's enough security to go in, then who takes over? Is it U.S. from the U.S.? United States, is it USAID or is it the military?
It depends on the portion of the country. If it's an area that is not secure, it is obviously under the combatant commander and his land forces, General McKiernan. To the extent it's an area that is secure, then the land component commander would very likely turn to some of these non-governmental organizations, and they would begin finding the ability to move in just as they did in Afghanistan in a secure environment and provide the kind of food assistance and water and the like that's available. The British are currently running a pipeline from Kuwait into Iraq to provide water, for example.
You mentioned Afghanistan. We have money in the supplemental, I noticed, for road repair project for the Afghan National Army, and I believe that is all important. There's nothing, though, for humanitarian or reconstruction needs in Afghanistan. There's thousands of displaced Afghans. I know in earlier budget there was no request for foreign aid for Afghanistan. Should there not be something in the supplemental if you've got all these hundreds of thousands of displaced Afghans? Is there any intent to ask humanitarian or reconstruction needs other than the road and the Afghan National Army?
That side of the activity in Afghanistan is being handled through the embassy and through AID. And whether or not they've requested funds, I just simply do not know. Do you know?
I'm not aware. I do know
Nothing
that.
in this budget that I could find. That's
Well,
what
I do
asked.
know I was just at the donors conference about 10 days ago in Brussels. We are still the leading individual country in terms of donations. There was $900 million for 02 and 03 combined. We are exceeding what we had promised, and we are still very much expending as we promised we would. So it's not just a matter of what's in the supplemental, Senator. It's what has been requested over the last couple of years, and these are just additional projects and additional activities over and above what we've already committed.
Well, last year, nothing was requested. Senator McConnell and I found money and put it in. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you very much. Senator Gregg?
Mr. Secretary, I was wondering if you could review again for us this issue of flexibility and what the scope of it is and why you feel it's important, and the time frame that it would, is it got a timed obsolescence tied to it that's tied to the war, or is
I'm
it
sorry, I'm
permanent?
having trouble hearing
Is it
you.
a permanent authority you want, and what's the scope of it?
The authority
and why
runs to
is
the
it important?
The authority runs to the supplemental, and it ends in the fiscal year, as I understand it. The reason it's needed is that we have committed a large number of forces. They are still flowing into the region. They will be used in different ways depending on decisions made by the combatant commander. We need the flexibility to move money between services and between accounts so that we can reimburse those people that actually expend the munitions, for example. We don't know which munitions will be expended at what rates, but we do know they're expending munitions at a high rate, and they vary. So what we need to do is to be able to have the money and be able to reimburse the services that have used those capabilities. The same thing's true with fuel. The same thing's true with the timing that they're there. I'll give you an example. We've mobilized a lot of reserves and Guard. We're going to be stopping that mobilization at some point. The decisions by the combatant commander as to what forces he wants to have there at any given time and what forces he can flow back to the United States and demobilize are questions that aren't currently decided. Therefore, one can't know which accounts need to be used for those longer periods or for the shorter periods. Therefore, the flexibility is absolutely critical. And there isn't any way to diagram it out.
Thank you. In the area of, you use the term, this request reasonably anticipates for what will be needed to the end of the year, so I'm presuming it anticipates what's needed to the end of this war, because whatever your time frame is, I presume it's shorter than the end of the year.
No, sir. There is anticipated that there will be costs after the kinetic aspect of the war ends. And what numbers of forces would be needed would depend on a variety of unknowables. How many other countries will offer forces and assist? How many other countries will offer financial assistance? How long will it actually take as you bring down the number of forces that are there for the combat portion and assist in the stabilization and the transition to an Iraqi national authority? Depending on how the war ends, it could affect how long a stabilization period there would be. So it's entirely possible that, I don't know if you, by using the word war, you meant the entire process, but I assumed you didn't. You did mean the entire process, and therefore I would think there would be costs next year that would relate to Iraq that would run into the next fiscal year.
I was more focusing on the conflict period as versus the reconstruction period, but I appreciate the answer. To what extent will the revenues that might be energized from the oil that is there be used to reimburse the costs of reconstruction?
I don't believe that the United States has the responsibility for reconstruction, in a sense. What we have is a responsibility to get that country on a path that it has a representative government that is fulfills the standards that General Myers outlined. We want to participate in reconstruction. Other countries will want to participate in reconstruction, and the funds can come from those various sources I mentioned: frozen assets, oil revenues, and a variety of other things, including the oil for food, which has a very substantial number of billions of dollars in it.
Do you expect a diplomatic initiative? I understand there is one coming forward from the Arabs, from some of the Arab states, supported, I guess, by France, and it appears even tacitly supported by General Secretary Annan, to go to the United Nations and attempt to initiate a ceasefire prior to our believing it's in the interests of our forces to have a ceasefire. Do you expect that type of a diplomatic initiative to occur? And if you do, or anything similar to that to occur, what is your reaction to it?
Oh, I have no idea what some country might propose, but there isn't going to be a ceasefire.
Senator Mikulski.
Good answer.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and to you, Mr. Secretary, General Myers. Like my colleagues, I want to express our support to you and to the troops who are fighting and in harm's way today. And that essentially takes me to my question, because I want to support them not only with words but with deeds, to make sure that they have the best weapons and the best support that they can. This then takes me to morale, to pay, and to military families, which I'm not sure is in the supplemental. We're taking a look at it. Mr. Secretary, we face a very significant issue in the sense that as we've mobilized our active duty, we've mobilized our reserve and our National Guard, and since September 11th, those units have been mobilized more frequently and for longer periods of time, and many right now are in the desert sands of Iraq. My question to you is that the families, because the families are facing hardships, we are now hearing stories in Maryland of a small businessman who, because he's been called up so many times and is now overseas, they've had to close their business, they've gone through their education funds, they are now living with parents and relatives, and I could go through any number of case examples where, as National Guards people and reserves, they were prepared to be called up. They were prepared to serve their country, but they were not prepared to be a part of a regular force called up several times, some 3 to 5 times since September 11th, and be away from their homes for more than 200 or 300 days. My question to you is, what is the United States government and the Department of Defense doing to think about how to help those military families? We've closed the gap. We are working to close the gap when supporting the regular forces. We agree, no Marine soldier or sailor's family should ever have to even think about being on food stamps again. But we are now facing that problem with National Guard and with reservists. And I really seek your advice, I seek your assistance, and you may seek my support to deal with this compelling issue.
Thank you, Senator. There is a substantial amount of money in to pay for required military and civilian personnel in this supplemental. Normal pay and benefits, of course, are in our annual budget, but the supplemental is important from that standpoint. There's one other thing I should say is that all of these people, of course, are volunteers, and you're right, some of them have been called up more often than others, and the reason for that is twofold. In some cases, a lot of people have volunteered to be called up. They've said, put me in the front of the queue because it fits my life, I want to do it, and I'm willing to serve. Others, through decisions that were made decades ago, are in activities and skill sets that only exist in the reserves, and we've got to fix that. Those people keep getting called up every time there's a Kosovo or a Bosnia or an Afghanistan or a...
Well, while we're fixing that, though, what about the fact that, again, if they've been called up frequently or for long periods of time, and again, no one's talking about shirking duty. They know when they joined the Guard or stayed with the reserves, they could be mobilized. But what about the financial gap facing families? Have we looked at that? Dov?
Sure. Well, in fact, that's why we have,
Or Hawk? I mean,
they say I'm the only dove in the Pentagon. We have $3.8 billion in this supplemental for the reserves, another 3.1 for the Guard. I do know exactly what you're talking about. My neighbor around the corner has 3 kids, oldest is 5. He's been away for a year, and he almost went away for 2. But he's exactly in the kind of specialty that the Secretary was talking about. Things like civil affairs, some of the medical specialties. Those are things that if we don't have the reserves, we just can't do anything about it. We won't have the capability.
but what do you have in there to help his family?
As I said, we have, for the reserve, mobilized reserve forces, $6.9 billion.
Well, will you be looking at, say, extra money for people who've been serving more than 200 days, more than 400 days?
I'll have to get you an answer for that for the record.
Because I think we need both the money and a framework for doing it while dealing with the long-range issues of skill sets that the Secretary has indicated. Be careful with contracting out, Mr. Secretary.
Senator's time expired.
I had a rent-a-cop defending my office and was asleep from 10 o'clock every morning until lunchtime. I hope National Security Agency doesn't face what we did.
Senator from Texas.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Secretary, as chairman of the Military Construction Subcommittee, I am, of course, interested in that part of your request. And I do understand the need for flexibility. I want you to have that because I know that you might not be able to anticipate an added runway or a taxiway or an apron, and you need to be able to do something quickly and pay the foreign government if that is the case. However, I do also want to ask that you notify us and make sure that we do stay in the loop so we know where our military construction dollars are going. We have been concerned that maybe operating and maintenance has been used for construction projects, and we want to make sure that we are staying on top of the military construction needs that you have, and also make sure that we do the job right for the military. So I'm going to submit some questions for the record, particularly about some runways and taxiways and some aprons to make sure that we are current in the requests, and also the part about the additional temporary facilities at Guantanamo Bay. You and I visited Guantanamo Bay along with Senator Feinstein, my ranking member, and I thought you did an excellent job in a very short time at equipping Guantanamo Bay. My question, though, is shouldn't we start doing something more permanent there if we are going to have the need for those facilities rather than continuing the temporary construction of more temporary facilities?
Well, first, Senator, I'm told that we have a briefing prepared on military construction with respect to the supplemental that should be available in a day or two. Second, with respect to Guantanamo Bay, I am so respectful of the taxpayers' dollars that I am resisting anything permanent down there at the present time, and I have not seen anything that has persuaded me that we ought to make dramatic changes. We're in the process of trying to have host countries that the people in Guantanamo Bay are nationals of take some of them and house them themselves. And to the extent we can manage the numbers and not get too many people down there, I'd feel better about the whole thing. So we're working the problem, and they have had to make some incremental improvements since we were there. They needed more locations that involved solitary confinement and for hard cases so that the interrogation process would work better.
Well, we want to be very supportive, and I know that you're watching the taxpayer dollars as well. I just want to make sure that we don't keep doing temporary things if it's going to be long-term, and we want to do everything that we need to do to maintain the security requirements for keeping those prisoners. My second point would just be, and I do want to see the briefing on the military construction part because we want to stay current on that, but we will be working with the department on the foreign military construction part of our responsibility because we are concerned that with all of the changes in priorities and even troop strength in overseas bases, that we not obligate dollars that may not be necessary even 2 years from now, much less 10. And we will be working on that down the road. But I want you to know I'm very insistent that we know what our foreign needs will be for the long term before we spend $2004 dollars. And I think we need to start looking at our foreign base changes in light of a potential 2005 BRAC in America in case we are bringing troops home that wouldn't have been anticipated a year or so ago.
I agree completely. There's no question but that we're looking at our global footprint. The world has changed. We're going to be making adjustments in our bases here in the United States, and we certainly are going to be making adjustments in our bases overseas. And it is important that we not pour a lot of money in this interim period prior to those decisions being finalized as to how we can best be arranged going forward in this 21st century.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr.
Thank you very much. Senator Murray?
Yes, Mr. Secretary, thank you very much for being here today. The President outlined to the American people that the Iraq War and Iraq's future will have broad benefit for our country and for the Middle East. And your comment a moment ago about our responsibility to reconstruct Iraq sort of puzzled me. Doesn't the President's larger objective for the Middle East and for our relations with the Muslim world and for the war on terrorism require us to have a long-term commitment to reconstruction in Iraq?
Sure. I hope I didn't say anything that left the contrary impression. There's no question, but that I was referring to the military side. We feel we need to stay there as long as it's necessary, but not any longer. Conversely, if you talk about the United States and the international community, we have to have an interest, and we have to see that country gets put on a path towards some sort of representative government and that is not going to threaten its neighbors. There's no question, but that if that is successful, as I believe it will be, that the economic circumstance in the region will be vastly better for Turkey, for Jordan, and for the other countries in the region.
Your term of putting it on a path concerned me. It sounded like we were going to put it on a path and walk away.
No, I don't mean to suggest that at all.
Well, then, are we working with the coalition of the willing, who, however, 60 countries, whatever, are involved, to get these countries to join the American taxpayers in paying for this reconstruction?
We are indeed. Dov Zakheim's been our kind of a lead person in helping to raise money, and not just money, but in-kind contributions. And he's worked hard on it, and the Department of State has worked hard on it. They're sending out cables, and responses are coming in, and nations are stepping forward.
Are we going to work through the United Nations to get those commitments?
I have no doubt in my mind, but the United Nations will have a role. I just don't know what it is. I know that France has indicated they would prefer that the United Nations not have a role, but I don't know what that'll mean. You want to comment?
Yes, we have already, I'm working alongside my counterparts, Alan Larson at the State Department, Undersecretary there, and Undersecretary John Taylor of the Treasury, and senior officials at AID and other departments. We are working together, reaching out to a number of countries who have been very positive about their willingness to contribute to reconstruction after the conflict. We don't know, as the Secretary just said, where the UN will be on this, but our intention is to reach out not just to individual countries, but to international financial institutions, to the EU, basically to anyone who is willing to help.
Appreciate that. Let me ask you another question. We've seen a lot of the news reports about the new healthcare technologies that are being deployed in Iraq, and I think that's very impressive to many of the families who are watching their sons and daughters, spouses over there. Can you talk about some of those new healthcare technologies, and specifically whether this supplemental request contains sufficient funding to speed care for our military?
I'm checking that out. I think, yes.
I do not know what's in the supplemental on that subject. I know that the armed forces have made significant progress in a variety of different ways. Number one, of course, and the most important, has been the ability to remove people from a battlefield very promptly and get them into an environment, healthcare environment that's as fine as can exist. A second thing they have done is they've made advances in techniques that can be used on the
Right, I was talking about the technologies, the new technologies.
well, here's one, the skin exposure reduction paste
Exactly.
is an example that we could provide you a list of some of these things that have been done.
Right, okay, I would appreciate that. I'd like to know what's in the supplemental on that. And one final comment in my last few seconds here. I think we are all very disturbed by the images of the POWs, and I know their families here in this country are really, there's a lot of anxiety. And I really want to urge you to communicate with these families, stay in touch with them. I know you're doing some of that, but I think that's extremely important. But I just wanted to ask quickly if you could update us on the efforts by the International Red Cross to see these POWs and whether or not we've had any progress.
I do not know what the status is of the International Red Cross ability to get access to our POWs. I know that we have contacted the International Red Cross and encouraged them to take a look and visit the now more than 4,500 prisoners of war that have been taken by coalition forces and that are currently in camps in Iraq, just behind the battlefields.
How about our POWs that are,
As I say, I do not, to my knowledge, the International Red Cross has not yet been successful in gaining access to them.
Well, I would just encourage you to stay in close touch with our families here who are watching news reports with a great deal of anxiety.
Mr. Chairman, may I ask a favor here? Since there was I may have answered an earlier question so cryptically or briefly that there might have been a misunderstanding. When Mr. Gregg asked me about the efforts on a ceasefire, Senator, I gave you a short answer that there wouldn't be a ceasefire.
I thought it was an excellent answer.
Well, what I want to just underline, in case there's any misunderstanding about that, at some point the war will end. And it will end at that point where that regime does not exist and a new regime is ready to go in its place. And at that point, there will be something of a ceasefire. You were referring to these suggestions of a premature ceasefire, and that is what I meant to say that would not happen.
Thank you very much. Senator Domenici?
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Secretary General, First, I don't know if this question has been asked. I have been at another hearing where I had to preside. But we keep hearing, and I keep watching, it's being said that we're moving toward Baghdad. We soon will be in Baghdad. Well, I will add to it now, and we will arrive at Baghdad. What will happen then? Baghdad's a great big city, isn't it? What do we do when we arrived at Baghdad? Do we have a city 6 times the size of Barsha that we got to do what we did there, or what do we expect?
Well, we have an example of that problem taking place right now in Basra. Basra is probably the third after Mosul, or second ahead of Mosul.
I said that, but I said it wrong. I said we've already been there, and it's much smaller, and we saw what happened there. And so now I'm asking what's going to happen at Baghdad, is it going to be similar to that or other?
It depends on whether the regime is still intact, but the answer is that what one has to do is first isolate it. There are in the city of Basra, just as in the city of Baghdad, there are Shia, and they are not terribly favorable to the regime. They've been repressed, and they are at the present time in Basra assisting us. And if you think of Baghdad as a city of 5+ million people, and you think of the population of Shia in there are probably 2.5, maybe 3 million people of the 5.5. The regime has tended to be fearful of them and repress them. And my guess is that what we'll see is these death squads, the regime death squads, doing what they're in Baghdad, doing what they're doing in Basra. They'll very likely have weapons out. They'll shoot people who try to surrender. They'll shoot people who try to assist. And we will go through a period where we have to deal with that problem. We'll put in strikes as necessary. We'll undoubtedly get assistance from people inside the country, inside the cities, and we will attack them and subdue them.
So when it is said that it might take considerably longer than expected, it might be that it's that kind of thing that we're talking about. How do you get from the outskirts of Baghdad through the outskirts to where you want to be to eliminate the regime? That's what might be what takes a long time. Is that correct, Mr. Secretary?
It could take some time. The forces, coalition forces, have moved from outside the country to within 50 miles of Baghdad in a week. The progress has been substantial. They now have face the more difficult forces, the Republican Guard. And then the next phase after they have been destroyed or surrender will be to deal with Baghdad.
Well, I'm complimenting you and them. They moved fast and moved quickly. I'm suggesting that my observation, just as a halfway informed citizen, is that once you've arrived at Baghdad, that will probably go slower. But let's just leave that alone. You've answered as best you could, and I thank you for it. I'm wondering about the so-called Republican Guard. Incidentally, as a Republican, I wonder why they call it that. I had to tell some of my children that they were no kin of the Republican Party. In any event, let me ask, with reference to the 2 major divisions, I have heard that and seen evidence that they are not conducting themselves the way they did in the first Desert Storm, and that they're not taking a position as armored tanks and moving on America with great numbers of tanks. They're isolating the tanks and putting them in shelters and the like. My question is, are those divisions, are we going to be able to fight those divisions in a major manner, or are we expecting that it will be all broken up in pieces, and which would be preferable for us, which would be better for our men and women?
Well, Dick Myers, you may want to answer, but I mean, the first choice is for them to be moving. They're easier to get at. At the present time, they've tucked back towards Baghdad somewhat, but now they're in deployed positions, as you indicated, in revetments. And what will happen is they'll get degraded from the air and then attacked by coalition forces.
I don't know that we can probably should go into much more operational detail, but the Secretary is exactly right. They are dispersed. They're dug in for the most part. When they move, we try to hit them. We are bringing a lot of force against them, to include our Apaches and our fixed-wing air, having some effect, we think, in degrading their combat capability. And at some point, at a time of our choosing, we will engage them, and we'll see what kind of fight they have.
Mr. Secretary, could I just say, with reference to two
Senator, your
systems?
time has expired. I'm sorry to tell you, I've just received word from the White House that they're expecting the Secretary to be there. Mr. Secretary,
Thank you very much.
Mr. Cole was bypassed by me by mistake. I would hope that you would answer Senator Cole's questions, and then we'll terminate your appearance and continue to have the hearing with Secretary Wolfowitz and Secretary Zackheim.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Ms. Secretary, as ranking member of the Agriculture Appropriations Subcommittee, I have concerns about the lack of specificity in a supplemental request for food aid to the Iraqi people. There's $8 billion for relief, but the request is vague about how that $8 billion will affect ongoing food aid efforts, including our work in Africa. The World Food Program has said that providing assistance to Iraq could well turn into the largest humanitarian operation in history. While I understand that supplies have started to trickle in, I'd like to hear more about our plans to address this crisis. Given the resistance that has been encountered so far in Iraq and the problems with the weather, are we concerned, Ms. Secretary, about a humanitarian crisis, as the UN seems to be? And if so, do we have backup plans if the resistance continues and food and water shortages become critical?
Well, Senator, we do not have any intelligence that would fit the words you've used of crisis and critical. There's no doubt but that there are places where the water is not right, where some lines have been broken, and we've got trucks going in providing water, and the UK has put a water line in from the Kuwait into the port, and they're bringing water in. But the number of refugees have been very, very small. There have been people have speculated it could be a humanitarian disaster and hundreds of thousands, as in previous times. Thus far, the numbers are very, very small. Second, with respect to food, the question you raise is not part of our supplemental. It's part of the Department of State, I believe, supplemental, and I would have to leave the answer there. But the forces, coalition forces, have brought food and water and medicine in. The fighting forces have brought food and water and medicine in from day one. As each area is pacified and made more secure, additional food and medicine and assistance is flowing in. I think that to suggest that there's a humanitarian crisis at the present time, I think is not something we've been able to find any intelligence to support.
Well, I'm glad to hear that, and of course we all hope indeed that that turns out to be the case. Mr. Secretary, in the first Gulf War, as you know, 80% of the dollar cost was paid by our allies. And we are hearing constantly and happily every day about more and more countries joining our coalition. The supplemental request includes $1.4 billion to help our coalition partners, but there's no detail on what their contribution to this effort may be. Do you have any comment on either what has been contributed or what you would hope will be contributed to this effort?
There is a long list of countries that have made contributions in terms of forces and ships and medical supplies and food and various types of assistance. I don't happen to have it with me, but it is a long and growing list. Second, there will be a donors conference that will go out and solicit funds from other countries. You're quite right. A major portion of the Gulf War in '91 was paid for. One of the principal countries was the country that had been invaded, Kuwait. A second country was Japan. And I'm sure that other countries will be making contributions. Dr. Zackheim has been kind of the lead person soliciting.
I thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Yes, thank you. Mr. Secretary, thank you, and General Myers, thank you. I've been informed that the reenlistment rates are up. I think that's a testimony to leadership that you are providing, and your men and women in uniform are providing, and have inspired our younger generation to volunteer in such great numbers. So thank you very much. With your permission, we'll continue on with Secretary Wolfowitz and Secretary Zakheim. There are senators that have not been had their questions answered yet, and it's my intention to continue through until all of those are here can have a chance to have their questions answered.
Mr. Chairman, can we
A portion of yesterday's Senate Appropriations Committee hearing with Defense Secretary Rumsfeld talking about the President's budget request to pay for the war with Iraq and defenses here at home.
2 o'clock. So it would be my intention to ask